So I'll ask Brother Dan then to speak to us on Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar.
Thanks very much, and evening all. One of the enigmas of the book of Job, or at least as far as the three friends and the book of Job is concerned, seems to me to be based on the following question. And that is, why is so much of the book dedicated to this dialogue between the three friends? 20 plus chapters are given over to this ordered dialogue that takes place. You know, it goes through each friend, one after the other, with Job being given a chance for rebuttal after each speech. Why not just have one friend who has a conversation with Job? Why not just have 10 verses that explain what divine retribution is and then leave it at that? Why have 20 chapters of this dialogue that keeps going on, as it were? Why do we need so much of this text? And I think that this is perhaps, at least for me, one of the keys to understanding the three friends and what they're all about as a whole. And hopefully we'll keep coming back to this question as we look at some of the text and some of the speeches of the friends. But one example of similar thinking to this I found in this book, on the book of Job. We've probably seen it before, but I thought this was very good advice for reading the book of Job. He says, he has a heading, and one of the headings is don't focus on the early chapters. And that's not to say they're not important. Clearly, he has a section about the early chapters. They are important. But in general, he says this, due to its size, the size of the book that is, and a predilection to focus on the parts we are familiar with, many people can wax eloquent on the questions generated by the prologue of the book. That is chapters 1 to 2, the bit about the Satan. The first two chapters are preparing the way for the speeches that follow. Becoming an expert in the Satan, so the first bit, or Job's disease, does not necessarily enhance one's appreciation of why Joab reacts to Zophar in the way that he does, or why Eliphaz doggedly holds on to a patently wrong philosophy. And I think that, at least I can see in my own mind, that I do this sometimes, which is, we think, okay, the book of Job, who's the Satan? What did Job suffer? And then the stuff in the middle, where there's all this, speech, goodness knows what that's all about, and then the maybe Elihu and God a little bit at the end, and we leave it at that, and sometimes miss the lion's share of the book, which is this section about the three friends. And he goes on as well. Job is a prodigious book in the vast range of its ideas and its broad coverage of human experience and so on. There's a lot in the section about the friends, and in fact maybe the most in some ways in the section about the friends, and it forms some of the keys to understanding what the book of Job is all about. So if there was a question that we want to try and think about tonight, it is, why is so much of the book of Job dedicated to this debate, this dialogue with each of these three friends? So I think we're probably familiar with the structure as a whole, but I'll put it up just in case. So the prologue is the first couple of chapters, and then after that we get this massive chunk, right? Chapters 3 through to chapter 26. It begins with Job's lament, and then we get each of the speeches which keep running on. And then after that, Job has a series of parables. That's chapters 27 to 31, and then there's Elihu's speeches and God's speeches, and then the epilogue at the end. But clearly it's the dialogue between the friends that we are interested in this evening. And again, we've probably all seen slides similar to this, or in books. This is the book of Job has a very simple structure. It's very well defined and easy to follow in the text because it follows the speeches of the friends. So it goes a friend followed by Job, next friend followed by Job, and they follow the same order all the way through until the last round where Zophar gives up and we don't get a third speech from Zophar. Now, before we get into the detail of this speech properly, I feel that it's probably customary to spend just a little bit of time thinking about the overall point that is made by the friends. I'm hoping we all understand this to some level, but just by way of background. So the message of the friends to Job is that he is suffering because of his sin. He must have done some terrible things that mean that God has now singled him out killed all his family, made his life unbearable because of sickness. In the book of Job, the argument is made that Job's individual suffering is because of Job's individual sin. And in fact, the way that this argument is made is in terms of what we call a syllogism, right? There's a logical argument. It has 3 prepositions and then 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So if you Google it, right, the famous one that comes up is Aristotle's syllogism. And it has a major and a minor premise and then a conclusion. Major premise, all humans are mortal. This is his famous one. Aristotle is human, therefore Aristotle is mortal. 2 premises followed by a conclusion. And we find a very similar thing in the book of Job. That in fact, that there is a syllogism that keeps being iterated on in the book, which is to do with exact retribution. So number 1, all suffering is the punishment of sin. Number 2, Job is a great sufferer. That's the minor premise. And then therefore, your conclusion is Job must be a great sinner. And you're probably aware that the problem in the logic is clause number 1, the major premise, which is it's true that suffering is a result of sin, but it is not true that individual suffering is as a result of individual sins. You know, there is such a thing as undeserved suffering in obviously the sense in which we're all mortal, we all have human nature. But nevertheless, Job was not necessarily worse than the people around him. And this is, a common misconception which is talked about a lot in the scriptures. As we know, for example, John chapter 9, who sinned that someone should be born blind? And the answer is neither his parents nor the man born blind. And there are many other passages that deal with the idea of exact retribution in the same way. We'll just turn up one of them just because I think it's very telling. The middle one there, Psalm 73. I just like it because here this is a psalm of the son of Korah, and he lays it on really thick, right, at the start. Very, very similar, in fact, to the book of Job. He says, verse 3, when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, there are no bands in their death. Their strength is firm. Neither are they plagued. Their pride covers them. Their eyes stand out with fatness. They are corrupt. They speak wickedly, and yet they're fine, he says. Their tongue walks through the earth. Nothing happens to them. And they say, verse 11, how does God know? Behold, these are the ungodly who prosper in the world, and they increase riches. How is this fair? The ungodly in the world seem to prosper. This is not divine retribution. This is, you look around and you see the wicked prospering, and the psalmist is going, how is this so? And then he comes to the kind of the realization a bit later on in verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their end. And the RV he understood their latter end. And there is a time when there is judgment. And in here, it seems to, there's a psalm of the sons of Korah. Perhaps he goes into the sanctuary and sees the censers, back in the day from the Korah's rebellion and so on. There is a time for judgment, but the friends misapplied it in terms of when that would be. And Psalm 73 makes it clear. And there's other examples as well. Ecclesiastes 7, we won't turn it up. I've seen a man that perishes in his righteousness, and also a wicked man that prolongs his life of wickedness. So, from the outset, the key doctrine that is proposed by the 3 friends is clearly not in accordance with Scripture. But we can also fall into the trap of being too harsh on the friends as well. And I kind of like to start off by thinking about that a little bit. There's another little booklet that was written about Job, and it has in it at the end some lots of quotes of the way that Christadelphians have understood the book of Job over the years. And one of them, it was from the Christadelphian in 1874. And I thought this was really good in how we should understand the friends. As to the light in which we are to regard the speeches of Job's friends, after the condemnation recorded in the last chapter, they are doubtless to be taken with some limitation, right? They're condemned. You have not spoken that which is right. But we must not take the limitation narrower than the condemnation requires. The 3 friends had not spoken concerning God that which was right, in contending that the present adversity was a token of his displeasure, or present prosperity his favor. But their general principles, thus misapplied with regard to time, were correct enough. God will bless the righteous and God will curse the wicked. They misapplied the true principle in the case of Job. There are elements of what the friends say which are clearly very much correct. And one of the ways that we can see this, I think this is the reason why sometimes we find that the three friends and their speeches are quoted in the New Testament. Perhaps we might remember there's a famous one where Eliphaz says, "Happy is the man who God corrects." And then Hebrews 12 uses the same principle. That's from chapter 4 or chapter 5 even, Eliphaz's first speech. There is elements of what the friends say which is correct, and we have to remember that as we read through some of these passages. But ultimately, at the end of the day, at the end in the epilogue, we're told God's position on the friends, and we've referred to it already. "Ye have not spoken spoken of me, the thing which is right, as my servant Job hath, lest I deal with you after your folly." They spoke that which was wrong about God. And in fact, if we were to summarize some of what they say, it's really folly as well. This is another element of the way we can understand it. They spoke folly about God in a sense. This is how we have to understand the words of the friends in the book of Job. So what do we know then about the friends? Just come to chapter 2 of the book of Job now. This is where we're introduced to the friends the first time. And we don't want to spend too much time on the background of these friends, mostly because we don't know that much as well. But let's just read a couple of these verses. Verse 11. Satan's disappeared off the scene now. Verse 11. "And when Job's three friends heard all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him." So what do we know about them? Well, there's first of all, there's Eliphaz. His name seems to mean God is gold. I'm not very sure about that. It's quite hard to tell what his name means. There's some other ideas as well. He seems to be the oldest of the friends, and likely a peer of Job's father. And we see that from a couple of verses in chapter 15 particularly. And very importantly, and we're going to talk about this a bit later on, Eliphaz is an Edomite. And Teman was one of the dukes of Edom, in fact. And this is where Eliphaz is from. And we may remember as well that Teman is associated in the Bible often with worldly wisdom. So the wisdom of the world, the wise from Teman, it talks about that in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Obadiah as well. And in fact, it's funny because Eliphaz seems very conscious of his own wisdom in this way. And in fact, it's an interesting thing that on the quote of the New Testament quotes of the friends, Eliphaz, the bottom one there, is quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and is kind of in the context of the wisdom of this world. So that this kind of thinking makes sense. The next friend is Bildad, and he seems to mean son of contention, according to Jusinius. And he's a descendant of Shua, it would seem, who's the son of Abraham by Keturah. And he's very bold, very direct, and perhaps in some ways, I think we're going to see a bit crueler than Eliphaz in what he has to say about Job. And then finally, we come to Zophar, and again, presumably his name means impudent. Like I say, some of these, there's a big caveat here because they're not that easy to figure out what these names mean. And we don't know very much about Zophar particularly. He's a Naamathite. So it's likely he comes from Naamah, which is a city on the south border of Judah. I think part of Edom again. So we think that two of the friends are in fact Edomites, which is very interesting, as we'll see later on. And he only speaks twice, and he's definitely the most harsh towards Job. And he's a bit more fiery as well in what he has to say. And hopefully we'll see that in a bit. But first of all, we have to remember when we talk about the three friends is that they came. They came to Job when Job was having a terrible time. And whatever it is that we're going to say about the friends, because clearly, there are condemnatory things to say about the friends. These friends were Job's friends, right? There's a passage a little bit later on in Job chapter 19. It's worth just flicking there, just very, very briefly. Job chapter 19, and Job describes how he was left all alone. Verse 13, he hath but my brethren far from me, says Job. Mine acquaintance was estranged from me. My kinsfolk have failed. My familiar friends have forgotten me. That's not the three friends. Job's been left alone. His family have left him. Well, half his family have died, right? His brethren far from him. And yet there were three friends who did come. You know, whatever we might have to say about the friends, you know, these were faithful men who cared for Job. They cared deeply for Job. You know, in times when loads of other people wouldn't touch Job with a barge pole, we find the three friends making their way to come and see their friend. And of course, they come and sit with him and mourn with him for 7 days. These are men of faith. They believed in God. They feared God. And that's apparent, you know, as we read through the narrative. These were undoubtedly people who had a sincere belief in the God of Israel and in his work in the world, even if they got things wrong. Back in Job chapter 2, they tear their robes with him. They weep with Job. You know, there's so much we can learn from the initial response of these friends in a way. And even, you know, later on, the brutality that they have in their speeches, really, that's like, in a way, they were that brutal because they cared. They were wrong, you know, which is by the by, but they cared about Job. And this seems to be the reason that they get more and more urgent as time goes on, as the next round of dialogue continues, because they care about Job. Their frustration seems to grow as the dialogue carried on. You know, if the book of Job stopped after chapter 2, then the friends would be legendary examples of what it would mean to be a good comforter. You know, we think of that verse when one member suffers, the whole body suffers with them. And there's lots that I think, you know, we can learn from the friends. There's a list of things that they do here in this chapter, which, you know, we can all seek to reflect in some way. For example, they heard. You know, they heard about what happened to Job. They weren't, you know, their ears were open to this poor man and his suffering and everything that happened. Perhaps, you know, we need to be trying to be aware of the needs of our friends and, you know, the people in our community. These were, the example of these men is amazing in some ways at the start. And they prepared, you know, they worked together to take action in verse 11. They make an appointment together to come and see Job. They clearly are people who care about this man. And then they go. They don't just send a card. They go and spend time with the person who's suffering. Go to those who suffer and are experiencing trial. And when they get there, you know, there's a beautiful empathy at first that the friends seem to have for Job. And like I say, if we left Job here, they would be amazing examples of comforters in that way. They shared in the grief of Job. They empathized with this suffering. When one member suffers, all the members suffer with him. And then they also stayed as well. And they stayed, as in that means sit in silence. The bit that they did after that was not so comforting. But nevertheless, they sat there for 7 days with Job. There's lots that we can learn from the three friends. And anything else that we might say about them in a negative sense, you know, has to be balanced with the way that they start off in this book. And now the storyline changes as the dialogue begins, really in chapter 3 and onwards. Let's just go back to this structure again. Again, you know, chapter 3 is Job's introductory lament, and then we get each of the rounds of the speeches at this point. And again, we like to come back to the question at the start, which is why so much time devoted to this dialogue? Why do we have so much text about all of this? And one of the things that I'm hoping we'll see is something, I don't know, I feel like there's a few of us here who are at Swanwick. Uncle Matt did Job, and he pointed out something about the three friends, which I thought was really good, and I kind of like to explore a little bit more. And that is that each of the three friends seems to bring a different perspective to the table. And I think this is going to be the reason why there is such a long dialogue, because it's not as simple as just, there is a layer of simplicity, which is they believe in divine retribution, first layer. But underneath that, there's a bit more complexity than that. Each friend has a different perspective that he brings. And it's really a different perspective of the mind of the flesh that will be brought before Job and kind of like debated out and hammered out between all of the friends and so on, and with Job as well. They each bring something else. They have the same doctrine, but there are nuances in their approach and the way that they come towards Job. And I think this is really very important, and perhaps one of the key reasons for why the dialogue is so long. As we unpack, perhaps the first layer of the simplicity, it turns out the responses of the friends are very different. And so the plan is, in the time we've got left, just to look at each one of the friends in turn. I'm not going to try too hard to summarize everything they say. I just like to pick more like a case study from each friend that's kind of hopefully sort of representative of the whole, just to see what they're about and see if we can figure out what kind of perspective it is that they bring to the table. So the first one is Eliphaz, and we're going to spend the longest time thinking about Eliphaz because Eliphaz has the most to say, and he appears to be the oldest of the friends as well, and he is the one who's addressed by God at the end. You've not done right, along with your two friends. He's kind of the key figure out of each of the three friends. And in terms of the case study, I just want to look at chapter 4 and 5. So he speaks first. He's the first friend to speak. And his first speech is chapters 4 and 5. And we just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about this speech. And we'll just go through the subheadings on the screen here. The first thing he says, basically, is, so he says, how can we not speak, verse 2. And then he says, behold, you've instructed many, you've strengthened the hands of the weak, your words have upholden him that was falling, and you've strengthened the feeble knees. Amazing, because, their words we know. We know those words from Isaiah 35, from Hebrews 12. These words are quoted elsewhere. He says, you've done all of these amazing things, and yet you can't handle it yourself. But now it is come, verse 5, upon you, and you faint. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. And the point is, you can't handle it yourself, Job. The things that you've helped other people through, when it comes to you, you just fall down. And in fact, we're going to see in a little bit, there's verses in the New Testament that sound a little bit like that. He saved others, but himself he cannot save. And perhaps we see, a little bit of what type of things the friends are actually bringing to the table here. And then the key statement of everything that Eliphaz is going to say is in verse 7. Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? This is, quintessential exact retribution. This is what it looks like. And in some ways, this is true. Some places else in Scripture quote this, like in Psalms. But of course, the idea is it's more like in the kingdom, people will receive their just reward, not necessarily in life. And so he goes on. There's a section in verses 12 to 21 that we won't look at now about Eliphaz's vision. And he has this whole vision that he's given. And the key of the vision is in verse 17. Shall a mortal man be more just than God, he says. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4. And then in chapter 5 carries on in a very similar vein. The wicked suffer a form from their own personal folly. That's like verses 1 to 7. And then he has this exhortation, encouragement to Job. Verse 8, seek unto God, return. All the, this thing that you've done wrong, it's time to return to God. And then verse 17 to 27, God will listen. God will deliver you if you listen to these words. But the key to understanding Eliphaz is that he appears to speak from personal experience and from wisdom as well. Like we say, that there's this idea of wisdom that comes about. And one of the reasons that we can see it, it's worth just perhaps underlining this. There's a key word that appears in Eliphaz's speech, and it is, I have seen. He's actually, I don't know if it's flippant, he's a bit like Ecclesiastes gone wrong. He's like, I've seen all of this over the course of my life, but whereas Ecclesiastes was like, I've seen this and he was right, Eliphaz is like, I've seen this, but he was wrong. He's Ecclesiastes gone wrong, is what Eliphaz is all about. For example, verse 8, I have seen they that plow iniquity shall reap the same. And incidentally, that's quoted. Again, a strange thing. It's quoted in Galatians. 5 verse 3, I have seen the foolish taking root. This is, Eliphaz the elder. These are the things that he's seen. And when we move on a little bit to the end of the vision again, it's like, there's experience with this man. He's an older man, verse 27. Lo, this we have searched. We have searched it, and so it is. Hear and know thou it for thy good. He searched these things out in his long experience. Eliphaz has seen that the righteous prosper and the wicked are cut off. And in fact, just move on to the next speech. We'll just spill over into that because we get the very similar types of language. So that's chapter 15, where this is the second round now. And we won't summarize this one, but just look at some of the things he says. Verse 10, with us are both the grey-headed and the very ancient men, much elder than thy father, in fact. Here is the man of experience. I have seen, I'm older than you. I'm older than your father, Job. I've seen that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. And again, he uses this key phrase again, verse 17. I will show thee, hear thou me, and that which I have seen, I will declare unto you. Eliphaz is Ecclesiastes gone wrong, I think. This is the type of language that he uses. And one of the things that is interesting about what Eliphaz says is that there is a very clear progression in his thought. And what the progression is, he gets more extreme as time goes on. So in his first vision, he's saying, look, you can't handle it, Job, firstly, and then whenever have the innocent perished? When is it that the righteous are cut off? It's kind of like questioning. He's diplomatic in a way in his first speech, slightly, not so personal in on Job as much as he could be. And he's actually more diplomatic than all of the rest, than the other two friends put together. And that should be made clear. In his second round, he's a bit more on the ball with Job. Should he reason with unprofitable talk, or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity. He's now, you're condemning yourself, Job, he says. There's more condemnation, slightly harsher tone in his words. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I. Yea, thine own lips testify against thee. And then the final speech is just a crazy thing. It's just insane. Is not thy wickedness great? That's chapter 22. We don't have to turn up. Thine iniquity is infinite. You've taken a pledge. You've stripped the naked. You've not given water to the weary. You've withholden bread. You've sent widows away empty. There's a list of things. What began as when do the righteous ever perish? Now he's just absolutely mental to Job by this point. He's really, hammering accusation after accusation. And it's one of those things that I wonder if there's things that we can learn from the friends in this way, because each friend, like particularly Eliphaz, he gets more extreme as he's challenged, and not more extreme because he finds more evidence, but more extreme just on the basis that he's challenged. And is there a sense in which sometimes we can do the same thing in pride, perhaps in dialogue that we might have about the word of God and so on, that we can take a position and for no reason other than our pride, get more and more extreme as time goes on. I think there's things that we can learn from the friends in this way, because he has no reason. Job's responses to Eliphaz are excellent in the things that he says, and we get to a point where clearly you can't agree with divine retribution even before you get later on in the book, and yet Eliphaz, against everything, keeps slogging on with the same viewpoint, and more extreme, in fact, as you go along. Is there a way in which we, in fact, can do the same thing sometimes, perhaps because of our pride in that way? We won't look at it now, but back in chapter 4, another part of this case study is really that Eliphaz's vision is pivotal to the book. These are my links. Ethan hardly found them for me, but I thought I'd copy and paste them. They're very good. And there's basically this thing, when it says, shall a man be more just than God? It's like, again and again, it will be a theme which is iterated on throughout the book, and it becomes a very important piece of the puzzle. But there's also irony in what Eliphaz says as well, because it's kind of funny. Eliphaz describes what would happen to a righteous man. He says, look, if you were righteous, you'd inspect your fold, where all your animals are kept, and you'd miss nothing. Thou shalt know also that thy seed, this is in chapter 5 in his first speech, your seed would be great. You'll have loads of children, and your offspring as the grass of the earth. And you'll come to thy grave in a full age. And yet it turns out this is exactly what would happen to Job in the end. There's like a certain irony. There's some humor in the book of Job. There's some sarcasm, and there's elements of irony, because this is exactly what happened to Job. Very similar language as well. He ends up with amazing amounts of sheep, 7 sons and 3 daughters. In fact, I think everything's doubled, isn't it, by the end? And he dies, virtually the same phrase, being old and full of days, exactly as Eliphaz had promised would happen. It kind of almost adds to the enigma and the problems of divine retribution, in a sense. And there's also this as well. And I think that this idea, that it's another kind of a little bit of irony in the book. And I think that this is really the lowest point for the friends. I think this is a terrible thing. Of all the things we may think that the friends did wrong in their speeches, in their dialogues, I think this is the lowest point. Because they don't just tell Job, you must have done something wrong. They describe in great detail what will happen to a wicked man. And in their detail, what they do is lay out exactly what happened to Job. And, they're just like, look at you, Job. This is the profile of a wicked man. You are exactly what a wicked man would look like. Is, the kind of the insensitivity of their words here is kind of mind-boggling. And it's clear that it's on purpose in a way to kind of add to the strength of their arguments. Eliphaz, for example, by the blast of God, the whirlwind, the breath of God, they shall perish. And that's exactly how Job's family died. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue. I won't read through all of these, but it's there. You can see it. As soon as you read the dialogue, there's plenty of places where this is true. The kind of the insensitivity of their words is beyond belief, and it's partly because of this that I think that it's kind of sadly one of the charges that I think we can probably lay at the door of the friends is that it appears. And it's not just based on this. There are other things as well we might talk about in a bit. It appears that they are resentful of Job and of his success at the start. And this partly drives some of what happens later on and some of their speeches later on. There is a resentfulness underneath each of these friends. And again, we think perhaps that there are lessons for that in us as well, for us. Rejoice not when thine enemy falleth. And clearly they weren't enemies, but there's an element of this. And let not thy heart be glad when he stumbles, lest Yahweh see it and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him. If we find ourselves being resentful when other people are doing well or happy when they fall, then there is something terribly wrong with the way that we're living our lives and our discipleship and before God. And I think perhaps there is an element of that. And there are other, like I say, I think there are other reasons for this too, in some of what the friends say. So we'll move on then to Bildad. And like I say, don't worry, we won't spend as long on the other 2 friends as on Eliphaz. But we just want to think now about this second friend, Bildad. And in order to do that, let's just go to chapter 8. This is Bildad's first speech. And Bildad and Eliphaz, in some ways, are kind of similar. There are similarities between the two. Zophar's kind of a bit on his own in some ways. Bildad and Eliphaz, a little bit more similar. But chapter 8, verses 1 to 4, starts out in some ways similar to what Eliphaz says. God won't pervert justice, basically. And then verse 5 to 7, if you were pure, you would prosper, is the key of what he's saying. And then it's interesting because in verse 8 to 10, I think this is now the key to Bildad's perspective. And it's a bit different from Eliphaz. Whereas Eliphaz was like, I've searched this out. I know, I've seen what happens. Bildad's different. He says, verse 8, for inquire, I pray thee, of a former age, and prepare thyself to search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days are shadow upon the earth. There's a sense in which Bildad appeals to tradition a lot more than Eliphaz did. He's actually more almost dogmatic in his religious tradition than Eliphaz was. And this is what H.P. Mansfield says about it. And I think this is a good summary, in fact, of the way that Bildad reasons. And again, I know that we can't read all of the speeches, but I think it helps just to have this summary. H.P. Mansfield, he is noted for his vehement speech. He does not reason, but merely quotes tradition, bowing down to the opinions of others. And this seems to be true, particularly here in this first speech. He is forthright. He's a forthright disclaimer rather than a reflective reasoner. And more dogmatic and blunt and severe and cruel than the courteous Eliphaz. That's definitely true. He's more like a calculator, like tradition says this, therefore you are this, than Eliphaz ever was. Though endorsing Eliphaz's teaching, he still believes in the same doctrine. His first address is an appeal, his second a rebuke, and his third is just an evasion. It's like very small, it's 5 or 6 verses long. But he says in verse 8, inquire of a former age, for we are nothing but yesterday. And so he brings out 3 proverbs that Job should be aware of. And these proverbs are then in the next section. So inquire of a former age, and then the 3 proverbs are, first of all, the reeds, secondly, a spider's web, and thirdly, a vine. And to be honest, I don't know if it was just me, I was struggling to see the kind of the point exactly of these proverbs, because I think he's saying when there's a reeds, he's saying if you take away the water, then the reeds will collapse, and that's what's happened to you, Job, because you're wicked. And then he's kind of like a spider's web, that all your strands will just break, and implying that Job is a spider as well, it seems, which is a bit harsh. And then there's a vine as well, and it's like while the vine's planted, everything's fine, but you've just been uprooted. So you're just going to wither and die. And that's verses 16 to 19. He uses, and the way that they're written, it seems to be a bit like ancient proverbs that he goes to determine what's going to happen to Job. But he seems to appeal more to tradition than Eliphaz did before him. And he's more dogmatic in this approach. So that's Bildad. And then finally, Zophar. And in order to think about Zophar, we want to think not about his first speech, but his second speech in the second round, which is in chapter 20, if you turn there. And I like Zophar because whereas sometimes like it would be slightly hard to tell the difference between Eliphaz and Bildad, you can spot Zophar a mile away because it's very different, the language that he uses. And I think sometimes perhaps it's obscured by the AV and we don't, like they all look just poetic in the same way, but it's very different, some of the style and the language of these speeches. And Zophar is very angry. And he's like that in the first, but he's very like that in the second speech. And we see this verses 1 to 5. He basically, I'm exasperated. He says, I've heard the check of my reproach, and the spirit of my understanding causes me to answer. And that seems to, Job says that you've reproached me 10 times in chapter 19. And Eliphaz said, I've heard that you've told me off for reproaching me. And then he says, perhaps similar to the other friends, verse 6 to 11, prosperity, the wicked is short-lived. Verse 12 to 19, sin and what happens if you sin. And verse 20 and 22, you can't escape God's punishment. But the bit that really changes, and it's kind of like here in all of them, but particularly in this last section, you can really see that Zophar is very angry. Just let's read verse 23. When he is about to fill his belly, God shall cast the fury of his wrath upon him, and it shall rain upon him while he's eating. He's like, and I think that the implication of the Hebrew, there's a hail of arrows that will come against the wicked man. But not only that, there's no use running from iron, verse 24, because the bronze bow is coming. You won't escape. The bronze bow will hit you, and it will go straight through, verse 24. The bow of brass, is the RV, will strike him through, and it is drawn, and it cometh out of the body. It's like you'll be caught, and the arrow will go straight through you. There's no use running. And then the wicked will be wounded by this arrow. All that's dark lies in wait for you. The earth will rise up against you. A raging flood will sweep you away. He's very graphic in his explanations of what will happen to the wicked man. Zophar is clearly, he's kind of much more emotive. He seems to have more like a fascination in the way that the wicked man will be destroyed in his time. And again, kind of brutal in its application to Job. He's much more angry, much more emotive than the other friends. And it seems that this is partly the reason why he then has no final speech. It's like he burns very hot and then just fizzles out, and we don't hear from him. We don't get a third speech from Zophar. It just kind of ends here with this massive tirade of what will happen to the wicked. So in summary, what really are the friends all about? Well, I think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think they fall into slightly different categories, because really Eliphaz is, I have seen in my long experience, I've searched this out, I'm wise, I'm an elder. He knows what Job has done and how it will work out for him. Bildad is different. Or Eliphaz is like, I think about these things, I understand. Bildad is more like, I've been told by the ancients. He's dogmatic, he's unabashed in his accusations all the way through. I know, I've been told this is going to happen to you. And Zophar is different again, He's like got this outburst of emotion. It's all about the feelings when it comes to Zophar. The different ways that he's like very emotive in his language. And I think that, in some ways this is clearly overarching. And like I say, there's overlap between Eliphaz and Bildad particularly. But I think what it is it's like different ways that the heart of the flesh deals with problems, and particularly with this question of why me? Why are we suffering here? This is like man's perspective, man's answer. And the reason why we need the dialogue is because there's more than one answer. There's more than one perspective. There's more than one type of reasoning that you might use in this way. And the collective of the three friends demonstrates that that's the case. And also, I don't know if this is true, but there's a sense in which it's not that bad in the way that, we have Ecclesiastes, we have the example of Jesus, right? He's like the perfect example of why divine retribution isn't the case. We have the whole of the scriptures, and it just shows, the things that these men were reasoning with are kind of like my experience, these proverbs, my emotions, and they kind of like hammer and tongs end up having to come to the same conclusion because of Job's situation. It's like, what do you do without the word of God? How do you reason? That's the kind of the thought behind each of why there's so much of these three friends. Now, I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. I think just looking, I just want to spend some time now, briefly at the end, thinking about the three friends as a whole and their message as a whole. Hopefully, we're aware of the idea that Job is a type of Christ. I didn't put up any proof of that. Hopefully it's obvious, it's kind of one of the things that the sufferings of Job become the sufferings of Christ, and we don't really have the time to talk about it now, but it's definitely the case. We read about the patience of Job in the New Testament. He's clearly, this positive example of the suffering of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he learned obedience through the things that he suffered, this type of language. But if Job is a type of Christ, then what does that make the friends? And really, it's kind of sad because the friends are positive. Well, they're faithful in the book of Job, but the thinking that is extrapolated from the friends is not so positive in the rest of Scripture. And it seems like they become like a type of the Scribes and the Pharisees. So, for example, trying to convict an innocent man, and you can perhaps look at the references later, leveled a series of false accusations against these people. Eliphaz, in chapter 22, it's crazy. His list of accusations against Job, very similar in the New Testament. They consider themselves wiser than the rest. Eliphaz, the man from Teman, very conscious of his own wisdom. Same in the Gospels. envious or resentful of success. I believe this is true of the friends, and it's definitely true in the New Testament. They tried to make biblical arguments, kind of like, spurious half-truths about certain passages in the Old Testament. And we find the same with Job's friends as well. They're clearly conscious of God, God-fearing people. But in fact, they go wrong. They appeal to tradition and religious dogma. It's definitely true of both of these. The Pharisees believed in divine retribution, almost certainly, as did Job's friends. They considered themselves elders in the community. And also, it's very interesting that the way that the dialogue ends, between Christ and the Pharisees is no man durst ask him any more questions. And the way that the book of Job is presented, you get to this stage where there's silence from the friends. And if for no other reason, just because the friends are, Zophar just gives in. There's no other response. And then Job's like, oh. And then he carries on with his parable, chapter 27 and beyond. There's this same element. There's like a silence. They finish. That arguments are kind of brought to nothing. I think that, if we're looking at the wider picture of Job and his friends, we can see it played out in the Scribes and the Pharisees. And it goes to show that, in fact, sometimes it can be true, and it seems to be of Job, that his worst suffering did not come from the Satan. It did not come from his disease. It seems to come from his friends. It seems to come from the people around him. And in fact, the same is true, is it not, of the Lord Jesus Christ? It seems like a lot of his suffering comes from the people, the scribes and the Pharisees, but also we might think of Judas and so on. A lot of the suffering comes from people. If Job is a type of Christ, then it also follows that Job is a type of Israel as well. And I have put up some verses on the screen because I don't know if there's slightly more evidence for there's a lot of evidence for this idea. And I just want to look at these briefly. For example, Job is called a byword. And that is the exact same word that's used of Israel in Deuteronomy 28, in the blessings and curses. And really interestingly, you know the phrase at the end of Job, it says, God turned Job's captivity. He turned his captivity. Why use that phrase? I think it's a kind of a synonym, or I don't know if that's the right word, for whatever it's called for like turning someone's fortunes. It doesn't just mean captivity, but it's the exact same Hebrew phrase that's used throughout Scripture for the turning of the captivity of Israel. They suffer for this long period of time, and then their captivity is turned at the end. Job is undoubtedly a type of Israel. There's a righteous man in his suffering becomes the suffering of the nation, the suffering of Israel. God gives him twice as much at the end. And God says, I will render double unto you, about the Jewish people. It says, Job, all the way through, there's this idea, this one of the conflicts is, I know that I will be justified, says Job. And I think a lot of the time, he doesn't say that in a self-righteous way. This is part of the narrative because of what the friends are accusing him of. And yet we find the same words when it comes to Israel. In Yahweh shall all the seed of Israel be justified. There are more that we could talk about. And I only have one table just because of time. I feel like you could fill about 3 tables with all of the links. Just one more example. This is what Job says about himself. And you could, if you took away Job, you would for sure say that this was talking about Israel. Oh, that I were in months past, in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. As I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. It's describing the nation of Israel, not just Job. Job is a type of the nation of Israel. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem. Here is a man who embodies Israel. And if Job embodies Israel, then what does that make the friends? And this is where it kind of gets sad because, the friends, they're faithful. But when it comes to the way that this plays out, it seems to play out that, in fact, some of the statements that the friends make come to light in more like anti-Semitic kind of ideas. And I think that this is another reason for why the dialogue is so long in the book of Job. Because in fact, it's expressing something, a hatred which would in fact, be not millions, thousands of years long in its expression and its complexity as well. The friends are Job's biggest test. And there's a couple of things. They try to pressure Job into a confession. You must search your deeds, confess. What have you done wrong? They list a ton of baseless, false accusations against Job, again and again, Eliphaz being the most extreme of those. And there's also an element of resentment in their words as well. And I do think that there's an element of this which is played out in the history of the nation of Israel. Though Israel may wash its hands every day, it is never clean. Its hands, at least, are always stained forever red with the blood of the prophets and the Lord himself. I think this next one is really good. Here's Gregory of Nyssa, who is definitely a Zophar kind of a character. Slayers of the Lord, murderers of the prophets, enemies of God, adversaries of grace, enemies of God again, haters of God, advocates of devil, brood of vipers, slanderers, scoffers, and so on. The list goes on. This is a Zophar kind of a person. Again, you can just, the same spirit of the friends that kind of germinates and becomes like anti-Semitism in many of its ways. And there's this element of, pressure to convert. And one example, the Spanish conversos, right? All of these Jews who are forced to convert to Catholicism in the 13th and 14th century. Search your deeds, convert or die or be expelled. Eventually the conversos were killed anyway, in fact. They list lots of baseless accusations against Job. He's a liar, he's a hypocrite, self-righteous. He makes empty prayers, he's crafty, he's taken pledges for nothing, he's stolen from the poor. And yet we find the same kind of spirit in the nations as well. A blood libel, you've killed Christian children and taken their blood, spreading the Black Plague. These are all things the Jews have been accused of: controlling money, controlling the media. Greedy, self-righteous, crafty, deceitful, mean. Deicide is what they're accused of, killing God. They're dirty, they poison wells. There's like a similar kind of a spirit on a grander scale that we found in the friends, manifested in the nations of the world. These friends, two of them at least, are Edomites, the prototypical anti-Semitism people are now expressing these ideas, in this way. There are some, for example, some of these phrases. You've swallowed down riches and you'll vomit them up again. And, it kind of conjures up pictures of things that the Jews would be described of through the centuries. He's violently taken away a house which he builded not. Or you've taken a pledge from your brother, Usually this is one of the things that the Jews were accused of constantly throughout the centuries. There seems to be this kind of an element in the three friends' speeches to some level. I appreciate we're running out of time, apologies. I'm almost finished. There's a resentment in their words. They say, we're good. In fact, it seems like we're better than you. Why are we counted as beasts, they say, when you're righteous? You're looking down on us, the friends say. There's this element of Christianity and Judaism that plays out in the same way. You're not closer to God than us, the friends say. Very similar, in fact. And here's the point. Job 23. He knows the way that I take, says Job. When he hath tried me, I will come forth as gold. And if that was true of Job, that is also true of Israel. Behold, I have refined thee, and not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. If Job was tried over thousands of years, or over his book, not thousands of years, and then the nation of Israel were tried over thousands of years, it makes sense that in fact it's the same purifying and purging process that was happening with Job. And there are quotes that we could talk about this, but one is Graham Pierce, who talks about the national experience of Israel. How 4,000 years under the hand of God shapes a nation is something outside of our experience. For the nation of Israel, there is a vast divine experience inbuilt throughout the generations. And this vast experience has been put on record for succeeding generations of Israel to study and appreciate. Perhaps the nation may be thought of as a living body. The body is made up of many cells. Individual cells die, but are continually renewed. So the body as a whole continues on its own distinctive life. So it is with the nation of Israel. And we'll stop it there, but being shaped over centuries, being refined for this role that they will play in the kingdom as a righteous nation, a people with this rich heritage. That's similar to what the book of Job talks about. So final couple of slides. Why then is so much of the book of Job dedicated to the dialogue with the friends? It's not a simple issue. The friends were faithful and they got the principle right in some ways, but they misapplied it in terms of timing. It's complex. It makes sense that you'd use this whole dialogue to express this principle. It's fundamental to human life to ask, why me? Suffering is something that's so universal. It makes sense, again, that these sorts of things take, it's given space and time for this dialogue to happen. And more than that, each of the friends seems to represent a different aspect of the thinking of the flesh. And in order to play that out on its full scale, it takes, again, 20 chapters, if not more. The three friends give us an insight into the persecution of Christ. And the dialogue can also perhaps help us to understand anti-Semitism as well, in some of its formative ways. And sometimes the hardest trials can come from the friends. So final slide, what can we learn from the friends and from the dialogue? Well, number one is clearly that the word of God is the only starting point. These friends, they come with I know, I think, I feel, all of the different aspects of the thinking of the flesh. But at the end of the day, all dialogue has to begin with only the word of God. And also they come with a preconceived conviction about someone's guilt. And clearly that kind of strong feeling must be a bad idea, to come to a dialogue or a situation or people in that way. We shouldn't make arguments personal. And someone pointed this out to me the other day, that the friends, they're always very personal back to Job with the arguments, whereas Job is very, very, not very often does he make things personal back to the friends. It's the friends who are personal towards Job, and clearly it's not the way to be. The friends twist Job's words against him. Clearly it's better to listen, to understand, rather than to listen to twist or listen to debate. Listening is clearly an important thing. Eliphaz becomes further entrenched in his views as time goes on, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And we ask, is there a way that we can in fact do the same thing sometimes in the way that we talk to one another? That despite evidence to the contrary, we get more and more convinced that our own way of thinking is correct. The friends make a litany of false accusations against Job. And that's never a good idea. And I think humility is clearly essential for any dialogue. And it seems to be something that Eliphaz, at least for sure, seems to be lacking. And also they seem by the end to demonstrate a lack of empathy. And to summarize that, it's more that we should aim to be open-minded. And I don't mean open-minded as in, so sometimes I feel that term is kind of hijacked nowadays, but open-minded, flexible, and humble, rather than being closed-minded or rigid, which Eliphaz seems to be, or proud in our approach to dialogue around the word of God. But I hope that that's helpful in understanding the three friends and their speeches.